throughout a lot of the history of learning in yeshivot, religious institutions, there's been a very strong emphasis on learning of the laws. Rav Kook writes a lot about this in Or Torah, on his book about Torah learning, and he says that there's been a neglect of the learning of Agada, of the stories and the spiritual lessons from the Talmud. And so, Rav Yonatan, I wanted to kind of ask you, have you ever felt like sometimes people can be such experts in laws and how to keep the laws of Shabbat, how to keep the laws of Kashrut, but if you would ask them a story that they connect to from the Talmud, they would look at you like, what are you doing? I guess just your thoughts on the neglect of learning of Agada, this incredibly important, genre of Torah learning.
I think that there's a push in yeshivot, to some degree the yeshivot that I spent time in, though being a Baal Tshuva, not growing up in a religious environment, I think the institutions that are involved with the people who don't have as much background are better about introducing Agada, but there certainly were Talmud classes that I learned in where the concern was moving forward with the halachic legal material as opposed to the Agadic material. There's this push to get to the bottom line. How is this lived in the world? Which is beautiful. And the Maharal talks about how really the purpose of Torah and Torah learning is to look through all the sources and to understand how all these things impact and are embodied with me to the extent that I live that. Mm-hmm. So that has taken on a certain, centrality, especially I think after 2,000 years of Galut, being out of our home. The most important thing is holding on to how I live this stuff into the world in the specific context that I live it in. I feel this much more when I travel to Chutz La'aretz than I do here in Israel. I have to look at the kashrut labels. I have to kind of watch where I walk, be aware of myself in a different way that I am here. But the Agadic texts, they're not concerned with the bottom line. I think that's difficult for some people because there's not one answer at the end of the day. There's so many different lenses to look through it, and it's incredible about story in general, and specifically about these stories, because there are stories, there are sages, there are people, there are history, that we can look at them now and see them through different lenses, through the historical reality that we're living in today. And because it has that superfluous kind of nature, I think it's the same issue people have with the social sciences as opposed to maybe more math and science. That if it's too touchy-feely or you can't give me a bottom line answer, it's more difficult for me to deal with.
Rav Kook has this piece in Or Torah where I would put it, he almost psychoanalyzes Bialik, Nachman Bialik. Now, anybody who doesn't know who Nachman Bialik was, he was, I would say, like the Shakespeare of Israeli poetry, the national poet of the beginning of Zionism. And Bialik went to the Volozhin Yeshiva, which was the most famous Talmudic yeshiva. It was in Russia.
Vilna.
In Vilna, sorry. Yeah, and what's amazing is Rav Kook, when he's describing what happened to Bialik there, because if you don't know, Bialik stopped being religious at a certain point of his life, still very passionate about Judaism, but when he stopped being, halachic, keeping laws, he still was in love with Agada. And he wrote a famous book called Sefer HaAgada, which what he did was, and he's the first person to do it as far as I know, he took all of the stories in the Talmud and he did what Rambam did in terms of laws. Bialik took all the stories and he codified it. He said every single story about King David, he went through all the Talmud, which takes a lot of time, and he said, I'm going to put it in a category called King David stories, and every story about prayer, about tefillah, I'm going to find them all and put them in a category. So any person who wants to learn about Agada in a really accessible, easy way, you can read this book called Sefer Agada. Now, the reason I brought up Bialik wasn't just to say that, but to say something about Rav Kook's perspective on why Bialik left religious Judaism. Bialik was so excited by poetry and stories. And Rav Kook thinks, this is Rav Kook's opinion, that he wasn't legitimized. That feeling wasn't legitimized in the Volozhin Yeshiva, and he was almost made to feel guilty, like, this is becoming too fluffy, too new age in our language. And because he felt so guilty for it, he ignored himself. He did not learn the more spiritual, stories within the Talmud, and he forced himself to learn the more dry, legal, halachic aspects. And little by little, Rav Kook says the Bialik just had enough. He couldn't deal with it anymore. His personality loves stories, poetry, and he had to express it some way. And you know what? The secular world enabled that experience. So he was actually legitimized as a poet. And Rav Kook, in that piece, he says, Chaval, like, it didn't have to be like this. And it's almost like Rav Kook is saying, if I would have been there, Rabbi Yonatan, he's like, if I would have been your Rebbe, your rabbi, I would have legitimized it, and I would have helped you and motivated you to excel in this amazing area, and you maybe wouldn't have been Bialik, you would have been Rabbi Bialik. And I know that Rav Kook was not only telling this from a theoretical place to Bialik, he's saying, look at me, I am obsessed with Agada. I wrote a book just like you, because Rav Kook wrote a commentary on a lot of the Agadot, or the stories from the Gemara of Shabbat and Brachot, and he says, and I believe that's an expression of the Torah and Mitzvot, and not a rebellion. So maybe your thoughts about maybe any students you've had that you feel like didn't find themselves in the normal, world of just talking about, did I keep Shabbat, did I keep Kashrut, and maybe were more excited about the more poetic, spiritual elements, and how Agada could be relevant for them. What do you think?
Our students at Hebrew U tend to not come from traditional Orthodox backgrounds where they learned a lot of Gemara in the kind of traditional sense that, like they did in Volozhin that you're speaking about. But I do think that what will speak to them are these stories, the why. I mean, especially for our generation, I find that these young people, they're looking for the why. If we can illustrate to them a meaningful and significant explanation why it is that these mitzvot, whether it be prayer or whatever it is, has spiritual depth to it. A relationship with God can be something incredibly meaningful, can add something tremendous to your life. Then they can really get buy-in, and they can really integrate these things into their life. So specifically, we try to utilize the text of Agada as openings for especially students with a basic background to enter into that world. I love the story of Bialik that you shared, because it really speaks to me as far as my story. Just on a personal note, when I was in university, when I first got to Florida State University as a freshman, I moved totally away from Judaism, not because of the legalistic parts of it, as you were describing, but more because the Judaism I grew up with was very
relevant,
social, and if there was a social circle, my friends who were non-Jewish were equally fun, if not more fun, than the Jewish kids. And so why be Jewish? But it was actually a Shabbat, a Friday night that I spent at the Hillel in Florida State University, where the rabbi there told a story of a famous Agada, the Tanur of Achinai's stove, and the idea that God smiles on his children who argue with him. That for me was a huge opening. A God who smiles. Now I don't know what kind of theology I soaked up as a kid, whether through secular sources or whatever, Hebrew school that I went to. But the idea that God laughs and smiles when his children have defeated him, and when his children are arguing.
Powerful imagery.
Against him.
Especially for somebody who's studying literature and imagery, that must have been powerful.
It was so moving for me. So because of that, I think we really try with our students to expose them to these type of ideas.
I think it's been forgotten. I really believe people don't know these stories exist, like an unkept secret. There are just this treasure of, and we're gonna do a few of them. There's just story after story, brilliant. They make you think, and it's just like, wow, this is ancient Judaism. I didn't know this stuff existed. I know personally when I started learning Gemara Brachot, that was my first exposure to it in yeshiva. I was just shocked by, wow, all these ancient stories, and from the perspective of, and what does it come to teach me? And it's just very refreshing. And I think any person who is a serious spiritual seeker, I think Agada, ancient Jewish stories, is something that you've got to get exposed to, and hopefully we're going to do a little bit of it together.
I hope so, and the relevance of them, that's the thing that really spoke to me as well.
Yeah.
As you said, it's ancient wisdom, but it really has so much to teach us in the world today.